is Zoe Kahn. I am a postdoc researcher at the RC Trust with Jat Singh, based in Germany. And before my postdoc, I graduated from the UC Berkeley School of Information. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today, that I'm really excited to share with you, is some of my dissertation research that's based on fieldwork that I conducted in rural villages in Togo, which is in West Africa. And this is joint work between myself, my colleague Karel Pere, who is from Togo, my colleague Emily Aiken, Nitin Kohli, and Josh Blumenstock, who worked on this with me while we were at UC Berkeley. So the plan is that I'm going to talk for probably about, 20 minutes or so. And what I want to first do is provide a little bit of background about the ways in which new data sources are both enabling new opportunities, but are also raising new privacy concerns. Then I'm going to turn and talk about research questions in Togo that seek to understand the privacy concerns of people living in rural villages in Togo. Then I'll talk briefly about the interviews that I conducted in Togo, and in particular, what I wanted to do here is highlight some of the new methods that I developed in order to do this work. And then I'll share what we learned about the privacy concerns of people living in rural Togo, and end with a discussion that sort of places the privacy concerns of the people that we interviewed in rural villages with prior work on privacy. So I think in this group, it's probably old news that big data is increasingly being passively collected about people. And one piece of data that is being collected, that was the focus of my research, is mobile phone metadata. And this is data that is routinely being collected by telecom companies. And in its raw form, it looks something like this. And basically, it is containing information about phone calls, text messages, mobile money transactions. Mobile money, for those of you who aren't familiar, is like Venmo in the US. I think there are other sort of like digital payment systems in Europe that I'm not familiar with yet. But basically mobile payment systems. And so there are records that are tied to things like how much money is in your account, like an account balance, who you're transferring money to, the amount of those transfers, and so forth. And all of this data is enabling lots of new opportunities. And most central to the research that I did is the work of my colleagues at Berkeley, who partnered with the government of Togo in the wake of the pandemic. And basically, my colleagues, Josh Blumenstock and Emily Aiken, trained machine learning models on mobile phone data to identify people living in poverty. And then those people were then eligible for cash transfers. But at the same time, when I started to do this work and I started to kind of look at the literature, there was a lot of concern about the ways in which the use of phone data was not only enabling new opportunities, but it was also presenting new privacy concerns, like consent. It can be really hard to provide meaningful consent to use phone data. How do you obtain meaningful consent to use somebody's phone data? Surveillance. There are like major concerns about how governments or corporations could use or misuse this data to surveil populations in different ways. Technical data privacy, it actually turns out that it's really hard to truly anonymize this data. And then compliance with privacy laws. In many places, phone data lies in this sort of gray area with regards to regulation. So it's not actually clear exactly how always to regulate it. But when I was doing this research, what I noticed is that all of this work was coming from domain experts. And when I use the word domain experts here, I'm referring to people who have received some sort of like training or professionalization in some domain, like be that data science or legal studies or history, among others. And what was notably absent were the perspectives of people with lived expertise whose data was being used and the people who were in many ways most impacted. And so when I use this term experiential experts, which I'm going to use kind of throughout our time together today, I'm drawing on a definition from Young et al. To refer to people who are living the experience or those closely associated with someone living the experience. And I think, in some ways it's worth pausing to ask this question, like, does it matter that the experiential experts are missing. I think on the one hand, we could argue and we could say, you know what, domain experts, they are really all we need. They have received professionalization, they've received training, they know how to identify these technical vulnerabilities, they can see the limitations of legal frameworks, so on and so forth. They're sufficient. On the other hand, we might actually think that experiential experts have a really different perspective that's really important. And in many ways, this is sort of the question that's in the background as I'm taking up this research in Togo. And so now I want to turn to the research questions. And just to kind of situate this a little bit, so my research questions are situated in Togo. Togo is a small country in West Africa of about 8 million people. Just to give you a sense of sort of what it's like in the places where I was collecting data, these were the villages. These are some palm nuts that were being harvested when I was there. And it's within this context of rural Togo that I was really interested in two questions here. First, what are the privacy concerns of experiential experts related to the use of mobile phone data in development? And then second, how do the concerns of experiential experts compare to those that are being raised by the domain experts? And so now I want to turn and talk about methods. And as I mentioned earlier, really focus here on a new method that I developed to make this work possible, which was totally unexpected. I did not go into this research intending to develop any new methods, but came out because there was sort of a need, and there it happened. So just to give you an overview, to understand the privacy concerns of these experiential experts in rural Togo, I conducted fieldwork and semi-structured interviews in rural villages. The research unfolded in three main phases. Happy to talk more in detail during our discussion to come, but at a high level, I started this work by conducting phone interviews to just understand the sort of broad research space. And then in the second phase, I conducted 2 weeks of pilot field work to refine the methods. And then in the final phase, phase 3, which was the main data collection, I spent 7 weeks in three rural villages. And I did interviews that were asking people about the sensitivity of phone data. And those are the interviews that I'm primarily going to talk to you about today. But I also did a separate set of interviews that were asking people about their experience with this entirely digital cash transfer program that was using phone data. And so in total, across this whole research, I interviewed 124 people. The focus for the work that I'm talking about today is based on 32 interviews that were specifically focused on privacy. And I think that this is quite an interdisciplinary audience, and so just wanted to briefly mention that my research approach here is sort of inductive and iterative, meaning that I don't go in with hypotheses, but instead the goal of this work is really to learn what is unexpected. And because the goal is to learn things that you never could have thought up, the rigor really comes from this iterative approach where you learn something new and you sort of adapt and ask new questions. And part of the reason why I tell you this is because what I'm going to share in a moment is how I adjusted methods in response to local context. And there was one time I was presenting this work to a group of economists, and someone raised their hand and they were like, I'm really confused because if an economist adjusts their methods in the middle of a study, that is like absolutely goes against all notions of rigor. And actually in this methodological approach, it's actually an indication of rigor. So as I've been talking about, the thing that I was really interested in is what sorts of privacy concerns do people in rural villages have about the use of phone data? And at first I thought it was going to be like pretty easy, but it turns out that it wasn't such a straightforward question to ask. And I quickly realized that in order to enable people living in rural villages in Togo, and I should say these are people with varying levels of formal education, varying levels of literacy, varying levels of familiarity with digital technologies. And so in order to enable them to provide meaningful input, I needed some way to explain mobile phone data, which again looks something like this, to my participants so that they could provide meaningful input, and to explain it in a way that they could get sort of an accurate mental model of the type of data that is and is not collected in phone data, as well as how it could be predictive of things like poverty, for example. And let's face it, like when I look at this, it's pretty confusing even to me, as somebody who has some technical training. And so what we did is develop these really simple, culturally relevant visuals to help scaffold conversations with people about phone data. And I actually have them here with me, so you can see they're like printed out and laminated. It was really important here that like my Togolese research collaborator, Karel, was really important here to help make sure that we were selecting images that were going to resonate with people locally. So for example, this is the map that is commonly taught in schools. And so if people had seen a map of Togo, this is probably the map that they would have been familiar with. Or we used images of phones, like using basic feature phones. And again, like these are the devices that people in rural villages are most familiar with. And just to give you a sense of sort of what it looked like in practice, you can see that they're durable, they're being used on the ground. You can see they're kind of interactive. Participants would often point to them or pick them up or rearrange them in different ways. And so they really were this sort of like communicative bridge where I could communicate about the phone data and people could articulate their ideas back to me by manipulating them in different ways. Okay, so what did we learn from this work? I'm going to tell you a story in a moment, but before doing that, what I want to do is just give you the high-level finding, which is that experiential experts raise really different privacy concerns than domain experts and vice versa. And so in particular, the experiential experts were concerned with how the revelation of data could harm interpersonal relationships related to concerns around shame or jealousy or the ways it could limit their autonomy, which is a really different set of privacy concerns than those that we saw earlier that were commonly being raised by these domain experts, which is much more about the use or misuse of data by these institutional actors. So I want to tell you a story. And this story takes place in the northern part of Togo. It's about an hour drive by car from the nearest city on a mixture of dirt roads and paved roads. And it's here that I interview Sumbila. And this is Sumbila on the slide. He's a 38-year-old man, and we interview him before he is about to go attend a funeral that afternoon. And I should mention that Sumbila is a pseudonym, so not his real name. And it's here that I talk with him about his perspective on the privacy concerns that arise from phone data. And we've just used the visuals that I showed you to describe the data that's recorded in phone data. And you can actually see them on the table there in this image. And then I ask him, how sensitive is this data? And he first thinks about people in his village, and he starts thinking about the data that's recorded in these mobile money transactions, which in his view, he says, could reveal some pretty sensitive financial data that he really wouldn't want others to know. He says, the one who gives mobile money can be harmed if it is known in the community because it is known that he has money to give to others. Some may be jealous of him, but the one receiving may feel some kind of shame. People in the community will have a bad opinion of him because he depends on other people to survive. And then I ask him to think about not about his community, but instead about the government of Togo. How would he feel if the government of Togo had access to this data? He said, I won't be disturbed if the Togo government knows about my mobile money balances and transactions. They'll know you're helping others. But among ourselves here, it may be disturbing. The government could know because they can't envy me. And so Sumbila is in many ways sort of emblematic of many of the people that I interviewed in this work. And really what we heard from participants is that the revelation of mobile phone data could really damage and harm interpersonal relationships. It could cause shame, especially in instances where it made it look like somebody was poor or couldn't feed their family, for example. It could bring jealousy, particularly in instances where people looked wealthy, or a bit less evident in this story, but also the ways in which it could limit people's autonomy. And this came out in particular sort of about spouses or partners being able to kind of restrict the spending of money. And so when placed in conversation with the concerns raised by domain experts in the literature, what we see is that experiential experts actually raise really different privacy concerns than domain experts and vice versa. And so the kind of question here is like, how do we make sense of these findings? And rather than argue that one type of expert or expertise is right and the other is wrong, what we demonstrate in the paper, and we can talk about more in the discussion, but what we demonstrate through these case studies is that experiential experts and domain experts are both essential to prevent against harms and to construct solutions. And so in other words, you could imagine that if we only paid attention to the privacy concerns being raised by domain experts and we ignored shame and jealousy and autonomy, we could design systems that might prevent against surveillance, but could really damage interpersonal relationships. Or on the other hand, if we only considered shame, jealousy, and autonomy, and we didn't consider surveillance, we could design solutions that would enable new technologies to enable governments to use these new technologies for widespread surveillance, for example. And so just to demonstrate that it's not that one type of expert is right and the other is wrong, but that they're both really important in this particular case. And so with that, I just sort of want to leave us with this takeaway that experiential experts and domain experts are both essential to identify harms and construct solutions. And thank you so much for your time. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm happy for this to be as informal and conversational, and really interested to hear about what everyone in this group has also been working on. So thank you so much.